Hi, Aaron. So I thought it would be interesting to try and explain what the idea of a research project on worship in particular, where it came from, what motivated that. Why is that an interesting research project? I thought maybe some of our viewers would be interested to know.
I hope they are, yeah. And thanks for asking, Sam. I guess it got started, at least in my mind, out of a sense of confusion and perplexity. So it just seemed like worship is a very, very central component of the religious life. Many traditions involve worship and having worship as a central component. And it would seem that worship is a good thing, at least in certain circumstances, according to those religious traditions. So in monotheistic traditions, one is enjoined, one is commanded to worship the one true God. And on the other hand, in many of these traditions, including Judaism, the tradition to which Sam and I both belong, there are very clear prohibitions on things you may not worship. Things, pretty much anything other than God, and you could just drop the pretty much. Anything other than God seems to be off limits. One can't worship those things. And on the face of it, maybe that seems perfectly reasonable and we understand it. But then you start thinking about some other things that we are permitted in these traditions to do, and not only permitted, but obligated to do. So in the Jewish tradition, one is expected to honor one's parents. One is expected to honor certain rabbis, teachers, the elderly, and even inanimate objects seem to have certain sanctity, like a Torah scroll is an object that we treat with some veneration. One stands up, according to the Jewish tradition, when a Torah scroll walks by. And then I was just confused, quite frankly, about what distinguishes one from the other. Right? What makes it...
for instance, veneration from worship.
Yeah, so we use these different terms,
honor
but it would be nice if I had some greater understanding of what makes something worship rather than, say, veneration or honor or whatnot. And so it was sort of the thinking about false worship or idolatry and its opposition to true worship, or the worship we're supposed to engage in, which got me thinking about the conceptual questions about what worship is and how it can be distinguished from other...
And it's not going to be enough to focus merely upon the object of the veneration. So you might think, well, worship is when you venerate God and everything else is not worship, because that won't be sufficient to make this distinction between idolatry and worship.
Exactly. Yeah.
The objects of idolatry, we take it not to be godly, and yet venerating them is idolatry, and venerating other things
precisely
is okay.
Yeah. And so then you go, you look for answers to these questions. And what's just very interesting is, in terms of a sociological fact, one might say, about contemporary philosophy, is that philosophy of religion is a heavily developed discipline at this point, and has treated many questions about religion. Most of the central aspects, I think, of belief in God and related matters. But worship has received relatively little, and I think that's an understatement. It's received almost no treatment, with the exception of a few articles here and there. And it just seemed like a topic ripe for discussion with Sam, and so together with you, Sam, we hatched this idea. And I think in part because we also thought the Jewish tradition could bring something to bear. So maybe you could say something about how you think the Jewish tradition bears on this uniquely, and how it offers a unique perspective.
Well, I suppose I think that particularly in a topic like worship, rather than perhaps some other topics in the philosophy of religion, I think it's really important to make sure that the discussion is rooted in a particular tradition, in a particular religious tradition, because what worship looks like and feels like and is in one religion might be very different to what it looks like, feels like and is in another religion. It might not even be possible to come up with a conceptual analysis of worship that's fitting for all religions. There might be a family of practices. So drinking wine and eating bread in a church for a Christian as an act of communion might be a very important act of worship for them. We might not see that as an act of worship or have acts of worship modeled in quite the same way. Likewise, when a Jew sits down and engages in limud Torah, of learning a text of Torah, many Jews would conceive of that as a very important part of their service of God and even their worship of God, depending on how some of these concepts, veneration, adoration, service and worship are related. So I thought that given that we both have an interest outside of this particular topic in encouraging growth, particularly in Jewish philosophy, that there'd be a good synergy here, because it's a topic that the philosophy of religion could do well to address, philosophy of worship, but it's also particularly calibrated such that contributions from within a particular tradition might be more salient or worthwhile than just abstract thought, armchair thinking about what worship might mean. And I suppose that leads on to another aspect of the project in terms of this project is a project that includes philosophers, but we also have a large number, or a good number, or some empirical scientists joining in our discussions of the nature and value of worship, and thought maybe you'd talk about what value that adds to the project.
Okay, yeah. So I think it adds value to have empirical researchers here in two directions, or for two audiences, and that's the audience of the empirical researchers, because it's important, I think, it should be evident that it's important in order to conduct empirical research on worship as any other human phenomenon, with some sort of definition in mind of what one's studying. And so if there is something out there, a single concept, and we can help sharpen it, and figure out what it is and analyze it, that would help. If it turns out that there isn't, and it's really a very multifaceted phenomenon, multi-track, it's a family resemblance sort of concept, that I think is also very important
Genus,
and helpful.
species, structure,
Yeah.
there could be all sorts of...
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful for the empirical scientists to be aware of in their study. And of course, there's also the benefit that we hope as philosophers to gain from the contributions from the empirical scientists, because worship is, after all, a human phenomenon, even it's a worship of something that is in many cases not human. It's a human phenomenon, and it's important to understand the rich texture that it has, how it manifests itself psychologically, maybe even neurologically, physiologically. And so that is something that we hope to gain, and I think we have gained from the sessions that we've had. I just wanted to follow up on one thing about the particular contribution that the Jewish tradition can make, or that particular traditions can make, which is bringing us back to my original perplexity of what characterizes something as idolatry. So in these traditions, and certainly in the Jewish tradition, idolatry is characterized first and foremost as foreign worship, right? So it's worship that's foreign to the deity, either the nature of the worship itself or the being that's worshipped is foreign. So it's a relative notion, right? It has its home in a context in which there is a monotheistic God. And for me, that raises a very fundamental issue about idolatry that I think has only been sharpened here, and I've been helped to see more clearly, which is whether there could be idolatry if there were no God. In a completely secularist framework, is there such a thing as idolatry? And I think some of the arguments that have been presented here very naturally can be construed as excellent arguments for the conclusion that there couldn't be. And we sometimes speak of something being idolatrous if you worship money or you worship a rock star, setting aside supposedly the question of whether there's a God. And I'm not sure anymore. I'm far from certain that such a thing makes any sense. And I think that reflection on the concept of worship from within certain religious traditions helps us see that.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Sam.
good luck to both of us for
Yes,
the rest of this
exactly,
project.
yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.